Hey, welcome to the dub of Masahiro Sakurai on creating games. This is the category compilation of game concepts. First up, Kirby's Dream Land. In the game concepts category of videos, I'd like to talk about the concepts behind the games I've directed myself. It'd be a waste not to. I won't be going into detail about every step of the process, but instead focusing on the core concepts of each title. I could talk for days about these games, but I'll try to keep it short and sweet. I say short, but these videos may run a bit longer than the others, so get comfortable. In 1992, Kirby's Dream Land. Today we'll be talking about the very first Kirby game. This was the first game I directed. My debut, you could say. I was 19 when I wrote the initial proposal. I was helping on other projects at the time, so we didn't start development until later. I didn't think as hard about risk and reward as I do now. I just thought it would be fun if the players could use the enemies. Why is that fun, you might ask, which I'll explain that more in another video. But in short, it's about risk and reward, and the dual purpose that enemies serve. Think in Mega Man. You can use the weapons of defeated bosses, but that's not using the enemies. It's more of a reward for beating them, which is a little different. When designing Kirby's Dream Land, I thought there had to be an easier way to take advantage of the enemies on screen. At first, I wanted Kirby to use his tongue to grab foes, but in the end, I decided to have him inhale them and spit them out. The tongue idea might make you think of Yoshi, but that was back before Yoshi even existed. Kirby has one more key trait. I gave him the ability to fly, because I thought it was too harsh to lose a life just for missing a jump. Think about being hit by an enemy versus falling into a pit. I'd say neither one is too serious of a mistake, but even in action games with health bars, falling usually meant instant death, so I kept the penalty for losing a life if you fall, but gave the players the ability to fly over gaps. You could use this to skip enemies too, but the Game Boy's screen was so small, I didn't mind making things a little easier. Inhaling enemies and flying both reduce the potential risks players face during gameplay. This might seem like it would have sucked all of the fun out of the game, but I wanted to make the first Kirby as accessible as possible to new players. During development, people asked, "Are you sure of this?" To which I replied, "Sure, I'm sure," and proceeded full steam ahead. When I first joined the game industry and started working in development, the NES was on its way out, and the NES was infamous for having a lot of difficult games. So one factor of that was the limited memory on an NES cartridge. You could only fit so much unique content, so if a game wasn't tough as nails, players would beat it too quickly, which that was a real letdown when games cost about 50 or 60 bucks a pop. So unlike RPGs where you fight the same battles over and over, action games, they struggle to offer long-term value, because if you made a game unreasonably hard, you'd be leaving the beginner players out in the cold. Which brings us back to Kirby, who I created to welcome newcomers to the world of games. Now, some games, they end when you beat them, but others, like arcade games, they're not so easy to put down, are they? So, it's fun if you'll just keep playing it again. Though the first Kirby, it was relatively easy. Those who played it, they kept going back for more. I'd say this was one of the better feeling action games on the Game Boy. And did you know that there's also a sound test in there as well? From the way each stage begins, right after the musical intro concludes, to Kirby's signature victory dance, you can see that we put a lot of love into the music as well. In the end, Kirby's Dream Land is still the best-selling game in the entire series. That just goes to show that positioning the game for beginners was a good decision for the time. And there you have it. In our next game concepts video, we'll be talking about Kirby's Adventure. And we'll continue from there in release order. First one done, we're moving on. Kirby's Adventure. Kirby's Adventure is the second installment in the Kirby series, and it's the first time to feature his iconic copy ability. Welcome to 1993, Kirby's Adventure! Right around the time we finished Kirby's Dream Land, the company initiated settlement proceedings. In other words, we were insolvent and on the verge of bankruptcy. Our PCs and other equipment got C's stickers slapped on them and everything. It was quite the experience, not one I ever thought I'd have. But during all that, the company gave me a mission to make Kirby's Dream Land for the NES, which they were probably envisioning a straight port of the Game Boy version. We started planning this in 1992, so the Super Nintendo had already been out for some time. Why didn't we make it for the SNES then? Simple. They wanted a game that could be developed and sold as quickly as possible. With the Super Nintendo, it would have taken too long to set up the dev environment, let alone actually make the game. Still, I thought Kirby's core concept as a game geared toward newcomers would have worked perfectly on the SNES, but maybe not so well on the original NES. By then, the NES market had already matured. I assumed there wouldn't be many beginners starting out with the system anymore. This created a unique challenge. How do I make something both beginners and veterans can enjoy? More than that, how do I satisfy them? What I ultimately came up with was the idea for the copy ability. This took the original concept of using enemies one step further. Players who aren't used to complex game mechanics can finish the game by just inhaling enemies and spitting them out, whereas more experienced players can dig deep into the copy ability and broaden their play experience. There's something there for everyone. If you do use copy abilities, certain parts might be more fun, or you might be able to pull off tricks, but you can technically play from start to the finish, just inhaling enemies and spitting them out. Here are a few pages from the design document I wrote. The art, it's a little rough, so you can tell just how short I was on time. But it's still fun to look at, don't you think? The copy ability also greatly increased Kirby's appeal as a character. Just watching him change forms and get new powers is fun in its own right. And it makes you look forward to each new enemy encounter. Every individual enemy had meaning, which was a huge deal. Of course, it wasn't going to be all that easy to develop, but it didn't seem impossible. Everyone on the development team really worked their tails off, which is why it came together so well. By the way, the Game Boy and the original NES, they display a different number of pixels on screen. Kirby himself has the same number of pixels in both games, so he ended up looking relatively smaller on the larger NES display. The aspect ratio is also different, which made him a little bit wider. With more space on the screen, Kirby's flying ability grows even stronger than before. It's possible to fly past just about any challenge in the game. I actually thought about removing flight entirely, but decided against it in the end. Instead, I expanded the information panel at the bottom of the screen. Not only does it restrict vertical space, but it makes the characters look bigger. It also gave us a spot to put fun pictures of each copy ability. We also confined mid-boss fights to just one screen. The limit was in utility, though it was in my first game too. With a few other tweaks like reduced flight speed, I think it ended up nicely balanced. Another notable aspect of Kirby's Adventure was its 3 one-button minigames. I think games can be made that only use one button, and included these as a nice extra geared towards novice players. All of the fun, none of the complex controls. Their entrances were on the world map too, so players were free to skip them. They were completely optional. At last, we finished. Development was stressful for a lot of reasons, and it really did a number on my stomach, but I think the end product holds its own against the many other titles in the NES library. If nothing else, giving Kirby the copy ability greatly contributed to his character appeal and popularity. It has a big impact on his later titles in the series. And for me personally, I was really glad I got to make a game for the NES. It was a true stroke of luck. Next up in our game concepts category will be Kirby Superstar. So, I'll see you then. Round 2 complete. Still with me? We're moving on. Kirby Superstar! Here we go. Today, I'll be talking about Kirby Superstar. This released on the Super Nintendo in 1996. Which is what brings us today. Kirby Superstar. After we finished Kirby's Adventure, there was a bit of downtime while we set up the SNES development environment, and it wasn't immediately all hands on deck. I was provided a Macintosh myself, and thus finally switched to an OS with a windowing system. Until then, I've been using computers like the PC 9801. Kirby Superstar was built on 2 main concepts: 2-player simultaneous play and omnibus format. Let's start with the first point, 2-player gameplay. During a conversation with Shigeru Miyamoto of Nintendo, Mr. Miyamoto asked me if a 2-player Kirby game would be possible. He said he'd been wanting to add this feature to the Super Mario series, but the fast-paced gameplay didn't allow for it. Kirby moves slower than Mario though, so you should be able to figure it out, right? Talk about a tall order. In side-scrolling action games, players tend to pull each other along as they scroll. It's one thing when fights are confined in something like belt-scrolling beat-em-ups, but cooperation isn't so simple in games where you have to jump over obstacles. It's true, the original Kirby was a slower game than Mario, so in theory it should have been fairly easy to pull off, but Kirby had already introduced copy abilities then, and different abilities moved at drastically different speeds. It might have actually been a tougher ask than Mario, though perhaps not if the hardware were capable of zooming in and out. Even tall orders must be filled, so I came up with the helper system. In other words, I divided players into lead and supporting roles. The camera follows the lead character. At times, the supporting character may end up off camera, so I designed a system to allow for that. If a character ends up too far off screen, they'll space jump right back. Instead of letting both characters scroll the screen with equal weight, I placed the focus on the lead character, Kirby. That, I thought, just might work. So, next I decided to combine the concept of lead and supporting roles with the copy ability. The enemies themselves could become playable characters. This boosted the fun and personality. 2 birds with 1 stone. Though, I knew it would actually be tough to make. We'd need to set character traits and the parameters for nearly every copy ability. But that was just what had to happen. This was when I first came up with the idea of copy hats. Originally, I just wanted some kind of item to create helpers, but they turned out to be a great way to dramatically boost Kirby's appeal. Kirby's design is pretty simple to begin with, so I think the added flair really suits him, don't you think? Those copy hats would go on to cause many headaches during Smash Bros. Development, but that's another story. Another new element of the copy ability was that the player could perform a wide range of moves based on button inputs. In Kirby's Adventure, each ability had only one move, but now there was a variety with repeat presses, directional inputs, and even command-based inputs. To compensate, we gave even standard enemies the ability to survive a few hits. In older titles, it usually took just one hit to defeat an enemy, but in making some moves stronger than others, we could really set different copy abilities apart. This became an essential element in the later titles of the Kirby series. At the same time, we changed up Kirby's health bar, going from the old 6-segment gauge to something more analog. Now for the other concept, the Omnibus collection format. In Kirby Superstar, you'll find a number of scenarios tackled on top of each other. Each one you pick will take you to a different game with its own unique theme. There's a racing game about eating food, and a more serious, story-driven game too. As for why I made it an omnibus, I did it because I thought we were seeing too many games that took too long to beat. At the time, more and more massive games kept hitting the market, and they all took a long time to finish. By creating an omnibus collection of quick-to-beat individual scenarios, each complete with their own unique gameplay, I thought I could provide a lot of content without causing players to grow tired of any one particular style. In truth, the first scenario, Spring Breeze, it wasn't planned to include the copy ability at all. I reluctantly put it in at the request of one of Nintendo's producers, but to this day, I still wish you could play without it, at least your first time though. Nothing really sets it apart from the next scenario after all. By the way, there was one more scenario from the planning stages. Kakero Mansion, which didn't end up in the final product. Kirby's mouth had been sealed shut, so he sets on a survival adventure using items based on the various copy abilities. It was ultimately cut for schedule and ROM space reasons. But on another note, we decided at some point mid-development to use CG in the backgrounds, which personally speaking, I don't think this turned out especially well. With the rise of games like Donkey Kong Country, CG backgrounds were growing more and more common at the time. But our staff wasn't familiar with the format, and it wasn't a great fit for Kirby, which requires piecing together various bits to entertain. Still, it's important to learn these new skills. The things you make today can lead to what you make tomorrow. With its two-player gameplay, omnibus format, and wealth of copy ability moves and hats, Kirby Superstar really was the definitive Kirby experience. In case you didn't know, I only directed 3 side-scrolling Kirby titles: the original Kirby Dream Land, Kirby's Adventure, and this game, Kirby Superstar. Though I've helped out with the series in various other capacities. In the next game concepts video, I'll be talking about Super Smash Brothers! So, see you then! And just as promised, we're moving on to Super Smash Bros! The year was 1996, right after we wrapped up development on Kirby Superstar. The N64 era was upon us. That brings us to 1999 Super Smash Bros. Once I'd make sure everything went smoothly with Kirby Superstar, I moved on to some independent 3D study. At the time, I had a Silicon graphics machine running software images to learn modeling and animation, camera design, rendering, and so much more. I already had little exposure to CG software from my time working on Superstar, but those were static images and ones made by other artists and so I decided to propose 2 games for Nintendo 64. The first was a 4-player, free-for-all fighting game, what later became Smash Bros. The other was an RC robot adventure game where you hacked into security cameras to progress. In the end, I went ahead and made prototypes for both of them. I did the design, graphics, modeling, and animation. Mr. Iwata handled the programming. We had one other person who worked on the audio too. And now, a never-before-seen look at the prototype we called Dragon King, the fighting game. Please, take a look. There were no special moves, dodges, or even items yet, but the game's rules were basically the same as Smash Bros, as you can see. It had smash attacks, mid-air jumps, shields, dashes, and 5-direction aerial attacks. A battlefield stage layout too, though you could change that. At the time, we were very limited in how we could configure models, but they still moved pretty well, I'd say. Both prototypes, Dragon King and the RC Adventure, were met with high praise from Nintendo. And so I waited for an opportunity. The truth of the matter was, the rest of the team at my company was already busy working on other games, meaning there was nobody available. Among these games were Mother 3 for the 64DD and a more snowboarding-like version of Air Ride It, unrelated to the GameCube game. We had several other titles in development too, but those were never announced. After all those projects ended up falling through, we needed a finished game as soon as possible. I felt like we were really onto something with the RC Adventure game too, but I could tell it would take 2 years to develop it properly. And so we went ahead with the one we could finish quicker, the 4-player fighting game. To backtrack a little bit, let's talk about the original thinking that led to Smash Bros. It's often called an antithesis to fighting games, a claim I've echoed myself, but that's not a rejection of fighting games. Fighting games are a lot of fun, in fact. This was a genre where push and pull really got a chance to shine. It was cultivated through years of rivalry, so it's no wonder these games took the world by storm. But let's talk about combos. To be honest, I didn't think there was any push and pull there. The gameplay revolves around how you string together attacks after the first hit, rendering your opponent's skill level irrelevant. As more fighting games became combo-focused, less room for strategy was there. If you didn't know the combos or were new to the game, you'd likely just be staring at the screen while you got beaten up. Instead of inputs alone determining the outcome, I wondered if we could make a game with more room for interplay and improvisation. That's how the accumulated damage system came to be. Your opponent reacts to hits differently every time. And if you get knocked off screen, you lose no matter how much damage you've taken. I thought, I might just be onto something here. So one more thing, I came up with the idea for the game in 1996, around when command inputs for fighting games were starting to get extremely complicated. Some of these were really intense. So, I opted for simple controls with a stick direction and a button, something players could intuitively pick up. There's also the smash input, performed by flicking the analog stick. With just a quick flick, you could unleash a stronger attack or jump. I came up with this after thinking about how to best utilize the N64's new analog stick. While others were focused on the analog nature for directional and tilt inputs, I was more interested in the time it took to complete those inputs. Now, when you think of Smash Bros, you can't help but think of its large roster of Nintendo characters. But this wasn't the original proposal at all. It's something we negotiated for later. One common struggle found in console-based fighting games is the sudden abundance of potential main characters. Think about The Legend of Zelda. You have one main character, Link, with plenty of side characters and adversaries. From a publicity standpoint, that lets you start with one main character and expand from there. But with fighting games, you might suddenly have 8 or even 12 main characters right in the game. For the customer, that's 12 new faces who just showed up out of nowhere, and it's not easy to make someone care about them. In an arcade setting, you can just sit down and start playing the game, or even watch somebody else play, which presents its own solution. At the very least, if you're rooting for someone playing a character, you might start favoring that character yourself. But I didn't want to throw players into a roster full of characters nobody had ever seen before. And I knew we needed to come up with an objective solution to this problem. In the end, we convinced Nintendo to let us borrow their most popular characters. The first impression this game gave would plague us right to the very end. After Smash Bros. Was finally finished, opinion within Nintendo was split. The developers who played games often really loved their time with the game, but sales team and wholesalers, they flat out rejected the idea of having Nintendo's characters beat each other up, though that was before they played it. We also struggled to reach people who had already the idea of traditional fighting games in their head. The strategies were completely different, and it was hard to break the preconceptions. In order to bridge that gap, I came up with a few solutions, including Super Smash Bros. Dojo! In the end, the game received positive reactions after release and gradually gained in popularity. So everything turned out alright, or even better, I'll say. I'm truly grateful for all of you who stood by us back then. Incidentally, this was the first time to use voice actors for the character. It's also when we settled on Kirby's official voice. Hi! As anyone who's toyed around in the various rules of Smash Bros. Knows, the game is very flexible in how it lets you play. You can turn on items and have a chaotic 4-player battle on a random stage, or have a white-knuckle one-on-one bout with items turned off. This philosophy of playing what you want is what was, to an extent, established here in the first Smash title. And that's a wrap. For the next up in the games concept category is Super Smash Bros. Melee. Ugh, final one of the video. Here we go. Super Smash Bros. Melee. Still with me? If you've been following along with us in the game concepts category, you'll know that concepts of my games are usually very logical in nature. In most cases, there's a problem to solve, and I designed the game to solve it. But the concept behind Super Smash Bros. Melee was actually extremely simple. 2001, here we are, Smash Bros. Melee. That was, of course, to power up Smash Bros. By leaps and bounds. You'll see it clearly if you compare the finished Melee to the original Smash Bros. But the fighters, stages, graphics, effects, animation, sounds, content, play feel, items, and bonus features, all of them got massive upgrades. To people at the time who had only known the N64 version of Smash, it must have been very eye-opening. With the N64, we faced numerous challenges, including hardware capabilities and the dev involvement. After all, one fighter in the original Smash Bros. Was composed of about 300 polygons. In a battle with 3 or more fighters, that was lowered to about 200 polygons. Not actually sure what that means. Well, it's basically as low as it gets for home console fighting games. So that's an incredibly tight restriction. Hence why Samus's legs were made of triangles. As for textures applied to the fighters, we were limited to a 64 by 64 pixels or even 32 by 32, which that is small. Smash Bros. Melee was developed for the GameCube though, which had vastly superior specs. It was much easier to develop for than the N64. Also, this was the first game I ever developed with optical disc media. I was a little late to the party, but I got used to streaming playback. In other words, music recorded with real instruments. Since this was my first chance with streaming playback, I used orchestral arrangements for several tracks. That led to various opportunities like the Press Start concerts, which lasted 10 years, and the numerous composer collaborations since we've had in the Smash Bros. Titles. This was also my first game to include a CG movie. We had no time to spare whatsoever, so I gave up my New Year's holiday to draw out some storyboards. One of the new bonus features we introduced was the trophy system. There was a limit to how many fighters we could include in the game, but this gave us a way to bring other characters from Nintendo's history and give players some nice fan service with a bonus background info about each object. Our friends at Creatures Inc., among others, helped us a lot to get that project out the door. Is this game really worth the immense labor it requires? That's a common question that I often ask myself and others ask me. Still, I'd say most creative works, not just games, have to do what they can to set themselves apart from the crowd. So, I rolled up my sleeves and did my best to make the game feel extra special. Well, that's what I always do, but still. By the time Smash Bros. Melee was announced and released, it was hugely anticipated all over the world. I'd like to think that it lived up to those high expectations. But what do you think? Well, I guess you can't answer unless you were around at the time. In the end, Super Smash Bros. Melee became the top seller among the GameCube titles. Now, next up in the game concepts category, we'll be talking about Kirby's Air Ride. But that's it. That's all 6 in the game concepts. Complete! That's all for the dub. We'll catch you in the next one.